Good morning, everybody. My name is Richard Dornhart. I'm the National Security Practice Manager from Data3, and welcome to our webinar today, where we'll be talking about cyber trends with Interpol. Before we get started, I just wanted to run through a couple of brief housekeeping items, just to make sure that we have an opportunity to get to questions. And what I'd like to ask you to do is, you should see a Q&A option in the webinar, and please take the opportunity to put your questions in there. We will hopefully have time at the end to answer some of your questions. And also, the ones that we don't get to, we will make sure that we come back to everybody on the webinar with a bit of an FAQ, pulling together all the questions that have been asked. The second thing is just a bit of a legal disclaimer, being that we are talking to Interpol today. We just want to call out that we won't be able to discuss any official Interpol business, nor will we be able to talk about any current investigations or other member countries. So just to get a little bit of housekeeping out of the way, and let's go ahead and get started by introducing who I have with me on the webinar today. And first, I'd like to introduce Corinne Vermack, who is a cybersecurity specialist from Cisco, who joins us with a lot of experience, and she's going to be co-monitoring with me today as we talk to our very special guest, Doug Witschi. Doug is a 30-year veteran in law enforcement and is currently an assistant deputy director at Interpol. How are you today, Corinne and Doug?
We're very well, thank you.
Yeah. Awesome. Great to have you both with me, and Doug, especially yourself, joining us from Singapore. Thank you very much. I thought before we got started into some of the questions that were actually posed prior to the event, Doug, maybe you could just spend a couple of minutes talking to us about what your role actually is within Interpol.
Yeah, thanks. Interesting question, and thanks so much for the invitation. Cisco's been a valued partner of Interpol for some time now, and we're obviously keen to support any activities that the partners have around these types of discussions. Look, I came into cybercrime about 12 months ago with Interpol. My role primarily was to establish the cyber threat response capability, which is primarily an intelligence-based capability, but more in relation to looking at that response element and how we can work with member countries, private-public partners, as well as other stakeholders across the industry, to be able to triage threat, look at different forms of response, and then obviously look at how we can actually mitigate that threat and reduce the harm. Our mission is primarily to reduce the effect and harm of cybercrime on the communities around the world. Interpol's got 196 member countries, which presents some interesting issues and challenges. But we are also a neutral organisation, so we don't get involved in state actor type of activities. Although at times our work and our activities, particularly around threat and our triage of threat, may lead or point to a state actor. For us, I guess COVID-19 was an interesting challenge for us. And through COVID-19, I also picked up the responsibility for global cybercrime operations for Interpol. And at the end of last year, I've taken over also as the operational lead for the Global Financial Crime Task Force, which is primarily looking at the issues around the COVID scams, the vaccinations, challenges around the counterfeit issues of COVID vaccinations globally, and business email compromise challenges, which I'm sure we'll talk about sometime during today's session. So that's what I'm about, and that's what we're trying to achieve here in Interpol. Our cybercrime operations are based in Singapore, but we do provide a global remit.
So question. Yeah, and quite a bit going on. It's interesting the commentary you made around COVID. There's been a lot of changes that we've seen over the last 12 months, not only from a cyber threat perspective, but also organizations have really had to change how they operate in many ways. They had to do that very, very quickly. I'm really curious, maybe to kick things off, if we might get a perspective on you, because I'm sure it's been a very busy 12 months. But to hear, what your team's seen over the last 12 months in terms of the global state of cybersecurity, what changes you've seen over the last 12 months.
Yeah, that's a great question, and I know Corinne and I have had long discussions around this, and we talked about what we term the perfect storm And really, it's been a tsunami for cyber criminals and their activities primarily. Obviously, setting up a cyber threat response area is not great as COVID's starting to emerge, and really it dictated and dominated my first 4 or 5 months in the job, and I still obviously a significant influence. But we've seen governments pump trillions of dollars into the global economy to try to keep their economies buoyant. We've got a digitalisation of organisations, as well as a movement out of offices to remote work locations. We still have the issues of IoT devices coming online with a plethora of different activities, devices, and I guess perceived needs that make life easier for people. But all these things together present new vulnerabilities and opportunities for cyber criminals. And with a lure like COVID-19 and the fear that's been generated globally, they've exploited it significantly. And for us, really through the last 12 months, big focus has been around ransomware attacks against health sectors, primarily hospitals, providing responses, but we've also seen it on the research areas around the vaccines. We've seen a significant number of scams around the COVID-19, whether it's circumventing supply chain around the hand wipes, face masks or the like, as well as now with the vaccines, we're starting to see some activity around those. And of late, we're sort of working with a number of member countries to sort of take some mitigation and some disruption activities around those things. But it's really just been a very dynamic space. We're seeing more and more uses of service type capabilities that have been purchased in the darknet. These provide access to, I guess, tools to commit crime in the virtual space. The issue for us then is we're not dealing with experienced programmers or coders. We're dealing with more lay people that are starting to take advantage of those. So really, cyber crimes becoming very low entry. The detection rates are challenging to attribute to targets. But we're working through with a number of strategies, and really the focus for us has been the value of our private-public partners, of which Cisco is one, and how we can actually work with them better to be able to quickly triage, look at opportunities, and then obviously work with our member countries to get them to take certain actions. So it's been a very dynamic environment.
Doug, it's amazing. Every time I hear you speak, there's so much that all of us can learn, and I really hear. One of our biggest threats is the human need for information, our need for information around COVID infection, information around vaccines, because that's what you were saying. But I want to ask you a question, and I think it's something that sits really well with all of our attendees today is, in all of those crimes that you've seen and that you've witnessed, is there anything that stands out from an Australia perspective? Are we more at risk with regards to something? And what have you seen out of your global view that's very, very prevalent within the Australian territory?
Sure, and that's a great question. I think for us, I was surprised actually to see some of the numbers that have been provided to us from private-public partners, and also stakeholders through the various discussion groups and networks that we have. I was surprised to see from one private-public partner that business email compromise from a targeting location, Australia's overly represented in the global scale, with around about just over 20% of business email compromises have been attributed to Australia over the last 12 months, which caught me by surprise. I actually thought it would have been a more varied, targeted market around the globe, but Australia seems to be overrepresented at business email compromise. But I think the other challenge too is we don't really truly understand the extent and nature of the victims around the world. Not many people, not everyone reports these crimes to police for a range of different reasons. I'm not even suggesting that police are great at taking reports, but what we've seen is, we've seen threats here in Singapore, that have obviously been attributed to various countries. I've seen victim data that we've been able to glean from partners. I've gone to countries like Australia and sort of presented that victim data to them, only to discover, and in one case, in Australia's case, we were aware of 11,000 victims in Australia, and there was only one report made to police. So that's really quite challenging when we're trying to fight. We're trying to sort of present a opportunity to national police services, but because they have low victim numbers, it's they've got other priorities. So we're competing against the national priorities when we bring these cases to various work through that issue with them as it progresses.
Doug, I wanted to circle back to something you said a few moments ago when you were talking about ransomware. I remember during our preparation for the call, you were talking about in the multiple stages of an attack. And I think in Australia, we've seen over the past 12 months some very significant ransomware attacks that have caused some major damage to some pretty high profile organizations. But I'd say the number of ransomware attacks, at least that we're seeing, has gone down. But you were talking about the phases and the fact that typically the actual ransomware is the fourth or fifth stage of that attack.
Yeah, sure. We actually see a penetration of some description, getting access to systems, sometimes the theft of data, and then obviously the deployment of ransomware. Now, this means that the ransomware is generally a final phase, locks up the system. Obviously, the demand for a payment, whether it's in Bitcoin, generally in Bitcoin. I think the thing with ransomware is, and with any cybercrime, you think that you're only dealing with one issue, but really there might be a multitude of different issues and different target vectors that have been applied. I mean, the nature of cybercrime is that once there's a penetration or an access to a data system, they've got almost a free run to various aspects and issues of the organisation, and whether you think that after one attack you're clear, I think that's rather naive, I guess, in the current times. The value of data, and obviously the data and you think about the data that are stored in organisations. That they'll know your employee lists. They'll probably know employee data around that business. It doesn't stop them in 2 or 3 years' time start to vector in on critical staff that they've been able to glean from the previous penetration, and obviously look at a further attack. So, for us with ransomware, we're always looking at the precursories, looking at how the penetration might have occurred. Whether it was a phishing or malware or whatever it might be, whether it was an individual that actually hit that link in the email that they possibly shouldn't have, that gave them that access. And I think now too, with the remote workforce and people working from home because of lockdown and the like, new vulnerabilities in the home environment. And we all had a bit of a giggle last week when a lawyer had the cat meme stuck on his Zoom call whilst he was talking to some judge. Funny. But, if your kids are using the systems that are also connecting to a corporation, there's potential additional vulnerabilities there that you might not even be aware of or have control of, because, your child or another relative may have looked at something, clicked the link, and you might be compromised, and you might be feeding that back into your corporate system. So it's a real dynamic environment for organisations now to think about the issues around the threat and the vulnerabilities they do have with the remote workforce, and they really need to consider that span of responsibility to extending out to ultimately the homes of the individuals that work within that agency. So, we really sort of try to think about how those vulnerabilities present themselves, how we can actually mitigate those threats, and how we can actually work through some remediation. It's been rapid change for everyone. A lot of organisations, as you said earlier, have been digitalising and changing their work practices and processes. The challenge with changing work practices to accommodate in a crisis is you have a tendency to cut corners too. So, really from a cybersecurity people within these organisations, you've got to think about what's happened, how it might have happened, and what may present as a risk or threat into the future.
As far as the business email compromise that you talked about. Now, I thought this was really interesting because, we hear you like to think that cyber criminals are doing, thinking about new and innovative ways to compromise organizations, but for some reason, email continues to be the #1 vector for attack. And you mentioned that we're disproportionately kind of attacked with those types of, spam. Do you have any particular guidelines based on your experience, anything that you've seen, or things that organizations are overlooking that we could take away from today?
Well, look, I think there's a tendency to trust email to some extent, particularly from people that you think that you're communicating with. And you're probably not looking for the dot out of place or the extra character in a email address, whatever it might be. You just assume, oh, that's probably just a glitch or that's something wrong, and you explain it away and you get on with business. I think what we've seen with BEC, it's a prevalent threat. We released a public awareness campaign, the primary target of business email compromise last year. And we'll continue to raise the awareness of this threat because it is quite damaging. I was out diving last weekend with a guy, and he was saying that they got caught up in quite a significant business email compromise to the tune of 6 figures, and they were able to, by sheer fluke, the insurance returned that payment to them. But I think that's going to be a thing of the past if it becomes more and more prevalent. So for us, it's about sort of trying to get people to think about all these transactions and processes. If people are changing accounts, I'd be picking up a phone, having a telephone call. Not to say that can't be spoofed or incorporated into some other process or practice, but we have to just think carefully about these issues, particularly when it's dealing with significant financial transactions and the movement of money. But it's an ongoing challenge, an ongoing threat. It will continue to continue. I think we're seeing a lot of BEC that's stemming out of Africa. They are persistent. I think it's the word. Not necessarily sophisticated. We're seeing some sophisticated attacks from other parts of the world, but a lot of these BEC attacks out of Africa are persistent, and they'll get knocked back, but they'll continue looking at various vectors to try to exploit an opportunity. So, just be conscious of those risks and threats. It's a challenging environment.
Doug, somebody once said to me that as a defender, we have to be right every time. As an attacker, you only have to be right once. So those persistent attacks really do become quite a headache. Richard, when we look at what Cisco also sees, similar to the trends that Doug have just spoken to, business email compromise is a big concern. It is for this current economic environment, it is rather concerning because it is, unfortunately, as you are well aware in your own discipline as practice lead, something that's not only covered by technology. So we have to look at technology that is full-fledged, grey mail, spam mail, looking at all of these kind of filters intuitively built into the technology, but also we have to look at user awareness. And I think that's a big part to things that we need to address collaboratively to fight cybercrime.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. And we're certainly seeing it with the customers that we deal with on a very regular basis. And it's just amazing to me that it's still email's been around for so long and it's still the #1 vector that criminals are using. I wanted to, again, go back to when we were talking a couple of days ago, Doug. You were talking about some of the reasons why we've seen increases in overall cyber activity. Some of the things that I thought were interesting that you're talking about was, like you mentioned, access to water and things that, these are things that I hadn't really contemplated in terms of why are we seeing more people take to this type of activity.
Sure.
You might be able to share some of your thoughts on that.
We've obviously got an organised crime element that sits behind organised cybercrime, and they're going to be, it's a business for them, which is quite tragic. But but there's other people that sort of come into the crime out of necessity. We're seeing unemployment. I mean, if you've worked in airlines, the last 12 months hasn't been great for you. Just as an example, I'm not saying that they're jumping on board with the low-level cybercrime, but particularly with the cyber for service type activities, we're seeing a lot of people out of necessity actually turning to cybercrime, and I think that's significant in relation to the fact that it just puts out new users. And as Corinne mentioned earlier, they only have to get lucky once. But, if they pump out 1 million, phishing emails or, some other type of activity, and they get, they get half a dozen hits, they're starting to make an income. So it's a real challenge and issue for us. We are identifying a lot of the low-level players as part of our activities. We farm them out to a lot of the nation states for follow-up and obviously for them to go and have a chat to them. At the moment, it's very challenging, particularly with COVID. Police are prioritising their work. They've got a health responsibility and response that they have to do in each of the countries. So these targets are sitting there waiting for to be actioned. But ideally, we'd like them actioned as quickly as possible. But it's really comes down to the local priorities for each of these countries. We've seen significant romance scams, people being exploited just because they thought they were in love, and we've had victims out to the tens of millions of dollars, that have been extorted, but basically removed from a company under the belief that they were doing the right thing, that everything was going to be okay. So it's quite prevalent. People are taking advantage of a lot of opportunity, and their market sector is significant in a global environment. We talked about, what cybercrime, the cost of cybercrime is to a global economy. Depending on which study you look at and which assessment and evaluations you are, it's in the trillions of dollars. One think tank's estimated around about 6 trillion and forecasting it to extend out to about 10.5 trillion by 2025. That's horrific. When you think that, the drug trade globally is around about $1 trillion. So, people are getting hurt, people are losing everything. And I guess the money that's being generated out of these types of activities it's just astronomical. Every man, woman and child that walks this planet, it works out to around about $765 US per year. Now, when you think a lot of countries don't earn that as an annual salary in a year. At some point in time, we have to look at how we respond to this. And it's a global issue. We need a global response. We've got a lot of countries doing some fantastic stuff, but they're limited to their national borders and I guess by extension sometimes to an extraterritorial requirement if it impacts on their citizens. But it's not going to really cut it at times when we've got people that know where the safe havens are, hiding those safe havens so they can't be touched. We've got others that, they just flout the law, knowing that it's going to be difficult for law enforcement or anyone else to be able to touch them. And I think we've actually got to think about, and by nature, the national legislative frameworks of all these different countries do provide levels of protection for these offenders as well. So we've got to think a lot more strategically, globally, on how we can actually tackle this challenge. And I know our Secretary General's labelled as the cyber pandemic, and really is really exacerbated with COVID-19.
It's interesting. Cyber pandemic. That's a really interesting way of positioning it. Sorry, Corinne, over to you.
Doug, I wanted to add on, and Richard, you may or may not be aware, in a previous life, I worked quite closely with Interpol in terms of the maturity of legislation, because that's a really important part. And I think that's something that Doug just touched on. The reality that in countries like Australia, there are task forces that looks at frameworks and giving guidelines and developing support for the country. But in many countries, they haven't adopted legislation around cybercrime as yet. And that effectively makes that a safe haven because the local law enforcement doesn't have a mechanism under which they can prosecute. And this becomes critical. Again, that's something that I think Doug will attest to is an absolute headache in Africa. And a lot of developing countries are battling with that adoption of the criminality around computer-driven crime. And saying that as, simplistic as I can, that in itself is one of the big battles that we have to fight globally.
It's a really interesting point. It kind of brings me to my next question. And Doug, you were talking about, how local, state, federal, and international police forces and organizations are working together to try to combat this problem. I guess I'd maybe be interested to just get a perspective from you on, we got a lot of different organizations on the call today. How can private organizations join, what types of, and support local and kind of international law enforcement?
Yeah, look, it's a good question. And I should stress that I don't think law enforcement is the only solution to the problem, which is important. We're into a response phase primarily. We get a bit of a sniff that there's a bad guy and we'll go and grab the bad guy. That's one way of responding to it. But there's other ways of obviously disrupting this type of activity. And, we're working with industry at the moment around preventative operations. We're looking at misconfigured servers globally, how we can reconfigure them so it prevents DDoS attacks, for example. We're scanning health facilities around the world to be able to identify vulnerabilities that can be exploited by cyber criminals, and we're letting them know so they can actually get them back up to speed. A lot of that work's also provided by private industry, which is fantastic. For us, I can't do my job without gateway partners, of which Cisco's one. We're obviously looking, and we're getting quite a few offers to partner with a whole range of different industry groups. I think we need that. The problem there's still a lead time for me to get partners on board, which presents some challenges. I think we need to start to share threat information a lot more readily across a whole range of different vectors. The certs as well as law enforcement as well as others. We need to establish an environment where we actually can communicate and talk to people fairly quickly. Time is sometimes of the essence. The other night, for example, the threat team here monitored some discussion in a dark web channel. It came through in assistance with one of the private-public partners, but it was the preparation for a ransomware deployment on a significant industry player. So we were able to go out and try to get onto the front foot in relation to that attack, and obviously engage with local law enforcement because that's where we are positioned. We hope in future that we might be able to triage these types of threats with a broader selection of groups outside of our gateway partners and law enforcement, potentially to include the certs and agencies like, the computer emergency response team. So for us, it's about working with a broad cross-section of the community. It's about understanding the threat. It's about trying to look at every opportunity to attribute, to see what we can do to prevent it, as well as obviously disrupt the threat actors that sit behind it. Locally, cybercrime is a human crime. It's committed by people. I think over the history of and the emergence of cybercrime, and dare I say it, I've seen it in my career, which is really tragic in one respect. But when it started, everyone looked at the technical issues around cyber, and they were a bit too hard. And people buried their heads in relation to the technical issues because they didn't understand them. And I think over time, they've still worked on the technical issues, but they're starting to look at the human factors around the crime type. And there's some really great work that's being done by a range of different academics around what to look for. The challenges and issues we see in the virtual environment applies to the criminal network. We're starting to get a lot more proactive in identifying their business practice vulnerabilities and looking at how we can exploit those vulnerabilities to be able to access information. Classic example of late, one of the private public partners that we work with identified an issue around, this malware that was going out, but the threat actor actually used the malware on himself to test it. And as a result, he left a vulnerability open that we're able to exploit and identify the threat actor. Great for us. But, you know, also some of these threat actors that do coding, you know, like, you know, a lot of us use Microsoft or whatever else they use, but, you know, you get the regular patches for issues that have been identified, you know, similar to the coding that's been used for exploitation as well. So, you know, we have to be a lot more proactive in relation to how we do our business. We have to be a lot more creative in how we actually look at how we disrupt and attribute. And we're working fairly closely with a range of different partners that provide us a lot of opportunities to, you know, do some things differently to be able to get the outcomes we need. So and we'll continue to do that.
Doug, I think that's a tremendous segue into one of our other discussion points. But before I venture down that, when you started, you said something that really stuck with me. You know, one of Interpol's key mandates is to reduce the effect of harm. And that's something as defenders across everything that we sometimes forget, is that harm element. And you also mentioned the fact that because people don't report it as private citizens to their local law enforcement, it really becomes hard to stress the importance of it. And I do think I can absolutely reiterate that as private sector, you know, doing the basics around reporting it when you have fallen victim to this. But something that we want to discuss with you is a lot of countries have come up with a sort of a framework or some guidance. And here in Australia, we're seeing a big drive behind what is called the Essential 8. And that really ties up very nicely with things that you've said. Under the Prevent Attack and Essential 8, they talk about patchwork and the importance of patchwork. And under the ambit of limit the extent of attack, you know, they talk about the importance of things like multi-factor authentication. And I want to use you a bit as a soundboard and ask you, what is your opinion around these kind of frameworks and how they give guidance to industry as to how do they better protect themselves?
Oh, I think they're very valuable frameworks. I think just having people thinking about the issues and challenges, risks and threats, I think is a very good thing. The fact that, you know, things have been articulated to share, I think are important. You know, it's a challenge for industry in one respect because, you know, you get frustrated with, you know, multi-factored verifications, you know, when you're trying to do something that's, oh, this used to be simple, you know, but obviously the security issues sometimes are, I guess, a hard sell to a customer base in some respects because, hey, you know, we're human, we like things easy. But, you know, like I think the frameworks are very valuable. We do look at a lot of the frameworks that come through. We are actively involved in a range of different discussions. It's actually a privilege to work at Interpol due to the access that we do have to, you know, discussions around the World Economic Forum, the United Nations, and the like. We are very, very keen to sort of expand, I guess, our activities with partners and actually look at how we can actually leverage off a range of different opportunities that some of these frameworks have flagged or identified and looked at that. But really, you know, for us, it's about, you know, together we make a difference. And I think that's the vital issue. I think, you know, police historically have been very, you know, they like to keep things to themselves. It's police business. You know, we're not great sharers. We like to collect information. I'm speaking from my personal perspective. I don't want to sort of impugn any national law enforcement. That's not what I'm here for. But you know, like you know, I know in my career, you know, like you know, you share certain information, you know, and when I came into the Interpol role, you know, I saw with the private-public partners quite a transactional relationship. You know, we put a request for information. It went out to the private-public partners. They assessed it, evaluated, and they responded to that. And I sort of looked at that process, and I just thought, this is just not going to work. I mean, it delays everything by weeks and months. So, you know, we now work collegiately. You know, we've got an office here in Singapore. Yep, it's locked down at the moment. But, you know, we've got private-public partners that actually sit with us. we have this beautiful wall between the private-public partners and our operational staff. That wall's gone. So we're all working on the room and discussing these things. We have a fortnightly meeting with all our partners to discuss threat, work through the threats. I've had so many conversations over the last 12 months with partners, and I sit down with them and start talking to them about some of the threats that we're seeing. And, they start saying, oh, we're working on that. And, it's just about trying to join up these dots and trying to get these things in place. I'm seeing some really impressive stuff coming out from a range of different sectors, groups. Europe is a driving force in relation to some of these issues around process and frameworks. Australia is doing some interesting stuff, particularly around some of their new legislation to combat the cyber threat. And we'll continue to work with all those stakeholders and partners to try to leverage off that and try to look at how we can actually incorporate that into our business models and operational activities. So that's what we try to do. It's a continuing, dynamic, ever-changing type of environment.
Doug, it's a good segue into one of the questions that has come through in the Q&A. Someone's asking about how do you have any influence? Do you work with like organizations like the Australian federal government in terms of policy? Is there a consultative process? How does that happen?
Look, we have the cyber ambassador and a number of key members from Australia that are part of our expert working group. So that they participate in a lot of discussions and issues. From a policy perspective, we primarily service the law enforcement industry. The 194 member countries primarily are factored through that national law enforcement arm. And under our charter, we primarily service those types of issues. So for government policy, we can provide advice, we can provide guidance, but we don't participate in that policy development per se. And from my perspective, I'm very much operational. My job is to improve the operational outcomes globally around the cybercrime threat. I spend some time talking to partners and talking about some of the issues like we're doing today. But my primary focus is to look at how we can actually, get more bodies into cold cells, warm bodies into cold cells is a common catch cry of mine, but also look at how we can actually disrupt some of the activity. So, although I do a lot of responsive work, I also have this preventative piece that we're trying to marry up as well. And we're very pleased to, be working with a number of key partners to look at these misconfigured servers. It's something that's been tried many, many times before. We're hoping that we can actually get a bit more impetus into this initiative. We've got 2 pilot countries now that are working through those challenges with 2 of our partners. And we're hoping to be able to extend that to a global response. So my job is really the operational piece. At the end of the day, a lot of people will develop policy. We hope to influence that to policy at the international level through the United Nations and World Economic Forum. We're well represented there. Craig Jones, the Director of Cybercrime here at Interpol, is actively involved in those types of activities. My job is just to see if I can get some bad guys. That's ultimately what it is. So.
I have another question here just around the perspective from cyber awareness. Obviously something that's really important. Kind of interested just to get your take on that. I think the comment here is that, let's see if I can find it again real quick. One of the biggest disruptions is education and awareness. So I'm sure, you obviously do a lot in that space. Any thoughts around that and types of strategies organizations could be bringing on?
It's something, like the hardest thing, I think, in education and awareness, and it's a big effort and it's a big lift for organisations to really contemplate and consider. It's actually trying to ingrain practices into the culture of the organisation, and it's actually trying to get people to think about the issues, the threats, and it becomes almost second nature. It's hard in organisations when there's an identified insider threat. It happens. It's a significant threat to organisations. How do you encourage people to report a potential insider threat, that's hard. It's dealing with people, but it's about building cultures around professionalism and awareness and capabilities, as well as just some simplistic rules, building it in so it becomes actually second nature to all your employees. And organisations are extremely dynamic. I mean, they're changing. You've got a rotation of staff. You always got to have a consistent flow in relation to those things. And I think for organisations, it can be quite frustrating that, you're repetitive and trying to repeat your message, and you're trying to look at different ways to really try to advise, guide, and instruct or direct your personnel. So it's not an easy task in relation to capability and capacity development. So for us, look, we've got a capability and capacity area. Look, we're primarily focused on law enforcement. We try to educate police around these issues. For us, it's a very different framework for organisations. But for organisations, it's a tough call, particularly when they do look at the bottom line, and there is a cost in relation to that. But I have to stress, like you look at some of the organisations in Australia over the last 12 months that have been hit with a ransomware or some other attack. The costs are significant for a vulnerability breach or a compromise in that environment, not only up to the bottom line, but also potentially to the future bottom line, as well as reputation, a whole range of other activities. And I think these are some of the challenges for organisations. Why report a breach when I'm going to have the Privacy Commissioner knocking on my door while I haven't been able to protect the data of people? And I think as a community, we've had some big data breaches over the last 10 years, and the issues around Cambridge Analytica and all those use of data. I think people are almost becoming desensitized to the fact that my data's out there and it's going to be used by someone, or someone's going to try to hack. And I think that's it's sad that we've gotten to this point. But I think organisations need to sort of think about biting the bullet and actually sharing the problem, because there may be a solution out there that if they share the problem, they might be able to get a resolution. And I'll talk about a recent case. No names, no pack drill. Company attacked, ransomware, pretty much locked up. Again, I'm out having a quiet dinner one day. I hear about this attack. I go back to the office. I sit down with the guys. We have a bit of a chat about the threat. Oh, we've got a decryption key on that one. If they had contacted us, we would have been able to resolve the issue through some partners. Now, it's just about sharing that problem, and the 3 or 4 weeks heartache that organisation had could have been resolved in an hour. And that's quite challenging, quite confronting from some. But there's a lot of fantastic people working across industry. There's a lot of fantastic people working across a range of different capabilities that are on the side of good. And they're working through the risks, threats and issues. There's always stuff emerging quite regularly that can solve or assist in remediating these types of threats. So unless you ask and share your problem, you're going to have some problems. You'll never know what's out there sometimes.
It's very good points. And I've just got a number of questions flowing through, Corinne, so I'm just going to try to get to a few of them.
That's perfect. That's perfect. Let's try and answer as much as we can.
And I think it's very topical in terms of information sharing, Doug. And is there how do we get to, is information shared in real time? How do we get to something like that? Like you mentioned just a moment ago, if the organization would have reached out or would have, we had the decryption key. How do we fix that? What in your opinion, what could we do to share information better? And because cyber happens in real time, right? These challenges.
Yeah.
What are your thoughts on that?
I think what we're seeing is our information sharing is improving quite quickly with national law enforcement. And I know Australia has tied up all the state polices, so there's a national response to issues around cyber, and there's a range of different operations that canvass across the area, as well as other government agencies like Australian Border Force and the like. So there's an integration of all the capabilities that may potentially respond to a cybercrime event in Australia. And I'll just use Australia as an example, which is fantastic. So, they're starting to see a threat. There's a National Crime Bureau, which is an Interpol desk as well as a Europol desk in Australia. They pump out the issues. It goes out it comes into our systems through our I-24 system or into Europol systems through Sienna. Whatever it is, they're sharing the problem. And then what's happening is we're starting to look at similar issues that might be seen in other parts of the world. So, my threat response team gets these, daily. We're getting them constantly and from all various different countries. And then we start to sort of triage those types of issues with private-public partners to look at the type of response or the advice that we can provide back to the member countries. I think, we're getting to the point where a country can't do this on its own. The complexities of these types of crimes, they'll be funneling, they'll be using infrastructure across, third-party countries. They'll be running money and the laundering money back through a whole range of different third-party countries. They'll be sitting in one country, but they'll be quite detached from everything else that's there. So, we need to sort of actually start to work a lot more collegiately, a lot closer in relation to those. Now, countries can pump out resources into all these partner countries to develop these bilateral relationships. They're going to be doing a lot of effort to try to get outcomes in relation to those activities, where an organisation like Interpol has the ability to be able to at least share information, start to talk about the problem, and try to look at solutions relatively quickly. So, we do work with a range of different partners. We do see some really cool stuff when it's flagged with us. We're quite quick at testing it, validating it, cross-referencing it to make, to ensure that what we're dealing with is correct. But we do have some positive successes. We work with our regional pols like Europol, Afropol, Asianapol, and we do work with these regional pols and other groups constantly to try to sort of mitigate some of the threats and risks that we're seeing. So, really, it is together we can make a difference. For an organisation, look, it's a business decision for organisations at the end of the day. I get it. You just got to look at the risks and the value proposition in relation to those. And sometimes you might have to bite the bullet, in all honesty, but you've got to obviously make that decision based on the circumstances and the issues and the risks and threats that you're actually seeing from an organisational perspective. I get it. But, we've got to change how we respond to this. If stuff's hitting my desk, we're not going to talk about it. We're not going to share it. If we go to the media, we make sure everyone's happy for us to go to the media. But we're not the type of organisation that will share information publicly because it's just not the right thing to do. And when you think about it too, I've got the United States, Russia, China, Iran, Australia, all Europe. I've got all these countries as member countries. Now, sometimes they don't want me to share their information with other countries, and we can manage that. Okay. I'm a neutral organisation. I work for a neutral organisation. It's in Interpol. We try to do the best to catch bad guys. That's what our job is. But we also have to be very conscious of the fact that people share information with us confidentially, and we have to preserve that confidentiality.
Doug, I think it's such amazing feedback that you're giving us, but what I'm also hearing you say is that information sharing starts with local law enforcement. And because of your mandate, it's how we weigh off. And I think that's rather important that organizations realize that disclosing that to local law enforcement doesn't necessarily always bring the bad media element if everything is done confidentially. But it is rather important that you cooperate because, as you mentioned now, everybody else can learn out of that, and you might already have the countermeasure for that specific attack, circumventing a lot of teary eyes and a lot of war room nightmares in a organization. Richard, do you have another question for us before we start wrapping up?
Yeah, I do have another here. It starts off with the SolarWinds attack, but I'm not going to ask you to get into any detail around the SolarWinds attack, Doug. But It's kind of stating that, attacks can come from anywhere at any time, and with greater reliance on third parties, which is, more and more we're seeing the integration of multiple third parties in order for us to be able to do business, and cloud providers. Do you have any advice around screening these providers, contract protection, those types of things? Just what's your take on cloud and how to protect ourselves?
Look, really great question. Really great question. I mean, I guess SolarWinds taken up a lot of the community's discussions over the last 6 weeks or so, and I've been dragged into a multitude of different discussions in the Middle East and various countries around the impacts of SolarWinds and the roles and functions and responsibilities in relation to that. Look, third parties, how are you going to validate and check, if there's any vulnerabilities, gaps, or issues with code from a third party? It's tough. It's a real hardcore question, and it's really difficult to try to think about how you actually deal with that. Now, look, I'm not a complex engineer in relation to these types of activities, but you have to think what's leaving your organisation and how you can monitor that information leaving it. I think the days of plug and play and just accepting everything's going to be working all right is probably good. Who knows what vulnerabilities, backdoors, and the like exists within third-party code for a plug, as a plug and play type of method, strategy. I think you got to be diligent, conscious of the potential threat and risk. You've got to put mechanisms in place just to monitor, track, and see if everything's working to your standards and ideas. From my perspective, it is, for an organisation, it is a challenge, and you just have to be on the ball and just don't accept everything on face value. Just to validate it, check it. I mean, obviously, in a commercial perspective and going into contracts in relation to those types of issues, think about those. I'm sure, the lawyers will be able to put in certain mechanisms and remediations in relation to those contract activities. But for us, SolarWinds is a significant issue, and it has broad and wide-ranging challenges for all of us collectively. So it'll be interesting to see how that plays up in the longer term. So the saga will continue for a little while, I'm sure.
It certainly is. I think it caught a number of us off guard, and it really got us all thinking very differently about how we interact with our third parties and to your point, how we really work with them to understand their cybersecurity controls. I can tell you that I spend at least 1 or 2 days a month, if not every other week, actually answering information from our customers where they're asking us about our cyber controls. And it's, there's a lot of that due diligence going on, and I think that's a really strong, it's a really good approach. And there's certainly a lot more that we can do. So we are coming to the top of the hour, and I think I'd like to ask one final question of both yourself and Corinne, which is one key takeaway. So if there was one thing you'd like to see people do better, or something that you want to leave and make sure everybody remembers, Doug, I'd love to get your thoughts on that, and then Corinne, I'll throw over to you.
Oh, look, for me, it's share your problem, talk it through. I mean, organisations like Cisco are great to sort of do some preliminary triage, look at issues, exploit every opportunity you can to extend the challenge and issue that you have with your partners and with your colleagues. I mean, for us, I can't do this role without the significant support and partnership that we do have with a range of different stakeholders, primarily our gateway partners, which Cisco's one, but also with the support and the availability of resourcing through our member countries. It's a really tough and dynamic environment. I think we've got some challenges still ahead. When you think that 75 million IoT devices, or 75 billion IoT devices by 2025 connected to the virtual environment, I think that just presents a whole range of new challenges, risks, and threats, and that impacts on organisations. I mean, everyone is connected to the virtual environment. is vulnerable, and they need to be thinking about their cybersecurity architecture, their processes and procedures, how they can educate their people to do these things. But sharing that problem together, because collectively we can potentially do something that can remediate these issues. And if worst case happens, we can actually determine potentially at least a response that may assist and overcome some of the immediate challenges.
Yeah,
I'm going to tie onto that and say I think it is agreed between the three parties on the call today that education is very critical, and education with the mindset of changing the cultural and removing some of these entry points to securing every person within your organization. But around that, I do also think if I were to give Richard, and the ask is, what is one piece of information? I think organizations should take a keen look at how they establish identity. And that's really, the critical part as to how do we verify who's on our network, because that doesn't only address the point of attacks and ransomware, but it also carves out very neatly how do we respond in this future world of IoT. Is that a bot? Is that a device? Or is that a person that is sanctioned to action certain applications? So I don't think I can stress education and a rethink of how we establish identity more in my answer.
And I think that's a really good point. Education and identity are, particularly as we move to a cloud-first environment, I would add to all of that is just understanding our information. Doug, you talked about it earlier. Once we understand who's on our network, let's understand what information is there and who has access to it. Because at the end of the day, that's what, in many cases, a threat actor is actually after, right? That's the gold. So understanding where your crown jewels are, wrapping the right security controls around those, and having a very strong cybersecurity strategy and policy. So that does bring us to the end of the hour. First, to everybody that's joined, thank you very much. We have a number of questions that we couldn't get to, but I will follow up with Doug, Corinne, and we will take a crack at answering those and coming back to you. Doug, thank you so much for taking time out of your busy schedule to spend the hour with us. It was extremely informative.
Richard, Corinne, it's been an absolute pleasure as always, and I really appreciate the opportunity to speak here today.